Okay, so my name's Fritz Westover. I'm a viticulturist. I've worked for about 20 years as a viticulturist. My start is actually closer to you in Ohio. I started at Penn State University. I'm actually a native to Pennsylvania. I grew up in the Poconos. And after I finished my undergrad in horticulture and master's in plant pathology, working with grapes, I worked with Tony Wolf over in Virginia Tech. That's where I met Alice Weiss, who's here on the panel today too. Hi, Alice. I worked there for 2 years as an extension research viticulturist before I moved to Texas and worked for Texas A&M for 7 years. Had a family move there, worked for 7 years until I realized I wanted to get out and go to the West Coast. I worked in California after I left Texas A&M and worked for a sustainability organization called the Vineyard Team, where we promoted educational programs and research for sustainability in vineyards in California. During that time, I started consulting back here in Texas and Georgia and the east of the Rockies regions and started Westover Vineyard Advising. And for the last 4 years, I've been extending the information that I give to my clients through my online academy, which is Virtual Viticulture Academy. So that's just a little bit about me. If you'd like to get a quick glimpse of where I work, this is just a quick map I made showing the regions where I work, primarily in Texas, where we have anything from acidic soil here in the east part of Texas to very high calcareous soil in the hill country of Texas to very high plains agronomic soil where we grow cotton, peanuts, things like that. I work a little bit in Arizona, and I work quite a bit in the mountains of North Georgia, where we also have acidic to neutral soils. So I work with a wide range of soils, and by no means am I a soil scientist, but I know enough about soils to integrate them into my plant nutrient analysis and fertilization strategies. And I think it's critical. I heard someone say you should take your soil samples about every 3 years, and that's what I recommend as well. Soils don't change dramatically unless you're adding some amendments, but plant tissue data changes seasonally and also throughout the season. So we want to monitor that. And just to give you an idea where I work, we get a lot of variability. So I see all ends of the spectrum, and I know Ohio has a wide range of variability across the state as well. So my philosophy is to only apply what is needed. We never want to, just throw out a NPK fertilizer, right? Because we need nitrogen. We would only put out nitrogen if that's all we need. So apply what is needed when it is needed. So we have to understand when plants are most readily uptaking nutrients and how to get them to the roots. And we want to use the correct formulation. Again, not just grabbing off the shelf a standard multi-purpose fertilizer, because if we apply a standard multi-purpose fertilizer with all of the nutrients year after year, we can end up with imbalances in not only our vine growth, but also our soil base saturation. So it really starts with knowing what your nutrients are that are commonly deficient in your site and your region. I think this is probably going to be covered extensively today, but I have here an organic matter particle that shows an attraction of cations, right? So we have on this cation exchange magnesium, calcium, sodium, hydrogen. There could be aluminum in there. And knowing the base saturation on your soil test can be very helpful because it can give you an understanding if you have a balance that is desirable for plant uptake. And not only that, when you see a deficiency in your plant tissue, you can look back at something like your base saturation. I can remember Terry Bates at Penn State always saying that if magnesium deficiency was common in your vineyard, he would see a trend for if potassium levels were 4 to 5 times as much as magnesium on the cation exchange, he could almost predict that there would be some sort of magnesium deficiency in the soil. So you can use those numbers to kind of not only predict what you might be seeing in the vineyard, but to predict what you might need in terms of fertilization. But I'm going to fall back on the fact that the plant is going to give you the missing piece of the puzzle, and more people, or every person who grows grapes, should be taking plant tissue data at least 1 time a year, if not twice. And I had to throw a soil photo in here. So I thank Maria Smith for sending this photo of a beautiful soil from the pit she dug recently. And a vineyard shows a lot of silty, probably clay loam and some clay subsoil. So I understand drain tiles are important in your region. I understand almost no one is using irrigation. So I won't be talking about fertigation as a strategy today. I'll be talking about soil applied and foliar applied nutrients. Okay, we all know that as we get to a more acidic soil, we have certain nutrients that are less available. I'm sure this has been covered many times and probably will be mentioned many times today. But what I want to mention here is, things like boron. We see deficiencies in boron even in acidic soils. And sometimes we even see zinc deficiencies, although it's not as common. But what we need to remember is that if we keep applying phosphorus, for example, which is not as much available or highly available at low pH or acidic soils, too much phosphorus can actually bind up zinc and make it less available to plants. So we have to watch these micronutrients over time if we're adding things like phosphorus, nitrogen over time, year after year as a maintenance application. So keep an eye on your micronutrients and know what your soil pH is. I know there's already been discussions about liming. I walked in right here at the end where we talked about that. Liming is a good way to get your soil pH into a more neutral range, or at least take it from 5.5 to 6, which can give you a very good increase in availability of nutrients. So enough about soil pH. What I want to get into now is understanding how nutrients are taken up by roots. This is important to understand, and I think the more growers pay attention to this, the more it's going to make sense to them how their strategy is working for fertilization. So we think about nitrogen. You'll hear me use nitrogen a lot as an example because it is a very commonly applied fertilizer in vineyards, and it's got a really dynamic way of moving in soil. Nitrates can move with what we call the mass flow. They can move through soil with moisture. And when you're getting 30 to 50 inches of rain during a normal year, where you are in Ohio, somewhere in that range, I believe, you're getting a lot of movement of nitrogen. Nitrogen can move from where you apply it on the surface as a nitrate, can move into the soil, and it can move past your root zone. And literally the nitrogen has to come into contact with roots where it can be taken up. Other nutrients are not going to move the same way. So we know that potassium has mobility in soil, but it's much less than nitrogen. So it's going to move slowly through the soil. It's better to incorporate it into the soil. Same thing with phosphorus. These nutrients are taken up by what we call diffusion, which is basically the roots need to grow into unexplored soil that hasn't been hit by a root yet, so to speak, of grape, and contact that nutrient in order to take it in to the vine. So you can dump a bunch of phosphorus onto the surface of your vineyard soil, but it's not going to readily move down with the rain. It'll eventually get down a little ways over time, or you can shank it in. There's different methods you could use, even shanking a liquid phosphorus into the soil. But the overall rule of thumb is if you're not getting it into the soil, it's going to sit there for a while, and you can't expect an immediate result from a soil application because it's simply not as mobile and roots need to grow into it and find it. And this is a good case for doing soil sampling, not only in your top soil horizon, your A horizon, but also your lower B horizon. So you can see what the sum of cations are there as well, because you want to know if as vines grow, they're going to be able to tap into some of those nutrients that may not be in the soil surface. I've seen examples where young vines in their first year can show severe potassium deficiency because the roots just aren't growing into the soil to hit it through diffusion, and they haven't gotten into the deeper soil where some of that potassium may be living. So that's usually a transient deficiency, and it's something that will pass over time. So you might want to avoid a knee-jerk reaction to apply large quantities of something like potassium early on if you see deficiencies, if it's not normal in older vines in your region. So the strategy I recommend to all the growers I work with and to everyone in general is to do a combination of soil analysis every roughly 3 years. And we always think of that, or I think of that as kind of your bank account, right? That's the money that you can withdraw from the ATM, right? It's all sitting in the bank account. If you don't have enough 5s, 10s, 1s, and 20s in your denomination, maybe you need to add those. Think of those as the potassium, magnesium, nitrogen, maybe phosphorus, right? Some of your most commonly deficient nutrients. Maybe it could be boron in your case. The petiole or leaf analysis, and I do both, and I'd be happy to discuss that, but I do primarily whole leaf blade analysis for the majority of my vineyards. I tend to add petiole samples when we want to tease out information because we're seeing either inconsistent results or deficiencies that we want to resolve or confirm. So the petiole is an active straw for nutrients. It's a highway where nutrients move around. The results you get from a petiole sample can differ if you take the samples early in the day or later in the hot afternoon. So you should always take them at the same time. I like leaf blades because they're a little more stable. They are a storage organ. I'm not saying that petiole are not useful. They are, just be consistent with how you take them. I like to use leaf and petiole both. What the plant data is going to tell you is what your plants are actually withdrawing from the ATM, which is the soil, right? So are they getting enough of their phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen? You can see that in the plant results. And then you also have to be aware that there's conditions in the vineyard that can affect the plant's ability to uptake certain nutrients. You've all probably heard of spring fever, where it's a cool, wet spring and nutrient uptake is not very efficient because we have low sunlight. Things like potassium deficiency become more of an issue. Drought seasons, that can be an issue, or drought periods, especially early in the season when we have high demand for nutrients, because if you don't have water movement in the soil and you're not irrigated, you don't have a way for that nitrogen and those mobile nutrients to move around and come into contact with roots in the mass flow. So the plant tissue data may not only tell you that you're deficient in the soil, it may also be telling you that there's conditions in the environment, which could be cloudy, rainy weather, or I'm sorry, droughty weather, or in some cases excessive rain, which could inhibit nutrient uptake as well. So keep that in mind when you're doing your plant tissue analysis. You might even want to take some seasonal notes about how the weather was, rainfall patterns, so you could really compare year to year. Okay, so what resources do I recommend for leaf blade? If leaf blade is new to you and you'd like to try it, you could use the Pacific Northwestern Guide for Nutrient Assessment. This is for irrigated vineyards, but it also is useful, I think, for non-irrigated vineyards because it gives you a baseline for comparison on where your nutrient level should be at bloom and veraison. And what I like about this is they also add a section for juice grapes, which is a little bit different for veraison in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. So if you're growing juice grapes or Concord, they also grow Concord in Washington, so they're interested in those numbers as well. So these numbers are published and available and can give you a good baseline start if you'd like to look at leaf blade analysis. As far as petioles go, probably the most useful guide is in the Wine Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America. That's edited by Tony Wolfe. And I use this, a little bit of modified version of this with my growers that I work with. One of the things that even Tony Wolfe himself has mentioned in conversations is that the nitrogen levels at bloom may not need to be this high necessarily. They can creep down a little lower, especially if your canopy vigor is good and everything's green. So talking down to 0.8 or 0.75 in some vineyards, and specifically for wine grapes. So those are some guidelines you can use. And here's what I want to talk about, the nutrient demand, because if we can understand when nutrients are most needed by plants, we can understand when to apply them. And most of the nutrient demand is from bloom, bud burst to bloom. That's the most rapid time of growth and uptake of nutrients. Most growers don't sample tissue until bloom. So what you're getting is kind of a progress report on how your season's going by taking that bloom tissue sample. And so I think of it as the progress report because you still have chance to improve. So if you're halfway through the semester, so to speak, and your grade's a B, you can still turn it into an A, maybe by the end of the semester. By the season's end, you could also improve things in your vineyard. So I like to say that if you're going to only sample once during the season, you should at least do it late in the season, because late season sampling can tell you what's needed to meet the demands next year on that bud burst through bloom period. So if you take them at bloom, those samples only at bloom, it's still useful data and it can help you to make adjustments for the rest of the season. But if you take them at veraison, that's when the highest demand for nutrients has been basically seen in the vineyard over the course of the whole season. It's more of your report card. And that's going to tell you what you need to do for that pre-bud burst to bud burst application. And that's important because if you're not in an irrigated vineyard, your primary means of putting at least large quantities of nutrients on if needed is going to be a soil application that's going to be either in the winter or before bud burst. So we really want to know late in the season what our plants are telling us about what they're going to need next year at bud burst. So if you can sample one time, sample at veraison. That's what I recommend. I prefer sampling both at bloom and veraison. I want to see the progress report and the final report card. This is just a little bit more representative of the season. It's usually 25 to 50% veraison. If all of your varieties are at different points at 25, 50%, try to find a sentinel variety in your vineyard, maybe one of your early red varieties or a late white variety, and just sample all the varieties then, because it's more practical to send them in all at once. And be consistent, do that every year. So let's talk a little bit about a few nutrients, and nitrogen in this case, and how they're available throughout the season. So this is a slide I borrowed from Marcus Keller, who wrote the book on the science of grapevines. And it talks about nitrogen timing and fertilizer application. So you have in the early season, most of your shoot growth is coming from storage reserves. So that's basically at bud break and even into bloom, you're still drawing off of reserve nutrients that are in your trunks, your cordons, and your roots. And because nitrogen is a mobile nutrient, it's going to be pushed up and into the system early in the season through your positive root pressure. So what we see on the red line is this nitrogen demand. Let's say we have bud burst here in April, May, then we have a high demand for nitrogen all the way into bloom, just a very steep curve. What the blue line shows is the potential for available nitrogen through the soil. So as the soil warms up, as microbes start to become more active, we start to see the cycling of nitrogen from carbon in the soil and organic matter. So there's a release of nitrogen in the soil. And as you can see, the trend is we get an increase in nitrogen over the season, and later in the season it peaks, or it actually declines. It peaks here right around bloom. So that's good. That means this is why some vineyards can go without fertilizing with nitrogen for many years, because if the organic matter is high enough in the soil and nitrogen cycling and availability is good, you can have nitrogen available to meet the demands of your vine leading into bloom. But where we have poor soil moisture availability, where we have many years of nitrogen depletion, your soil may not be able to keep up with this high demand, and that's why we run into deficiencies at times. There's another little spike here for nitrogen demand near veraison, another good reason to sample your tissues near veraison. And of course, the demands will go down as we get close to harvest. By the time you get to veraison, if you try to put nitrogen on the soil in a non-irrigated vineyard, it's probably going to take a while for it to get moved into the soil. You're going to have to hope that it rains, and that's not really efficient or effective. So that's why sometimes foliar nitrogen applications become very handy throughout the season, later in the season, especially if you're seeing tissue reports coming back low in nitrogen. So let's talk more about nitrogen, because it is a good example case study to follow. Release from nitrogen from the soil, there's none of these numbers are set in stone, but if you need a good kind of well-rounded number, these are numbers I've been working with over the years. If you have, let's say, 1% organic matter in your soil, for every 0.5%, you can get approximately 20 units or 20 pounds of available nitrogen over the course of the season. You'll see sometimes there's an ENR, an estimated nitrogen release from your organic matter, and sometimes it's 80 pounds, 100 pounds per acre. And you could use that as a guideline, but you still need to test your plant tissue to see if your vines are effectively taking that nitrogen up. The release from nitrogen from something like compost, a lot of vineyards are curious about adding compost to their vineyard as a multiple source of nutrients, and to add organic matter and add microbial bioactivity to the soil. About 30% of that total nitrogen is available. Usually a compost producer will supply you with a report. About 20% of that is available in year 1, and years 2 and 3, maybe another 10%, maybe nothing. And then of course, if you put fertilizers, if you put irrigation water out, there could be nitrogen or other fertilizers going with your irrigation water. Regardless of that, if you water at all, you should really be looking at your water source and where it comes from. Probably not a big thing for non-irrigated vineyards, but it can be significant where groundwater contains nitrogen and boron. Okay, great slide here. It's not too technical if I help break it down for you here. It's from a study in Germany, and I really like this one because it's very helpful to demonstrate to growers why we time fertilizers at certain times of the season based on growth stages or phenology. So down here we have bud burst starting here in the beginning. We go to flowering, veraison, and then maturity here at the end. And these lines here with the different colors are just different fertilizers, or nutrients rather. And this is the major nutrient uptake throughout the season of these different nutrients. This is a study that was done on Riesling in Germany, but it will apply in general to most vines as a rule of thumb. Early in the season, high calcium uptake by plants. That's why we want to have that calcium or that lime application in the fall or in the winter, so we have available calcium to vines early in the season. Once we start to get into flowering, we see a spike in nitrogen, that's in green, and potassium in purple. And if you look at the spike, it's very high, and that shouldn't make you think that you should always apply more nitrogen and potassium than other nutrients, but that's just telling us that the vine needs more of those nutrients. So even when you look at the test results and the recommendations on the standards charts for petiole or leaf, you'll see that, for example, magnesium, which is way down here, you only need about 0.3% in your petiole, and you would need about more like 1% in your nitrogen and 1.5% in your potassium, roughly. So that's why those are higher. But there is a spike in magnesium here. So there is a demand for magnesium after flowering. So applying magnesium, whether it be through dolomitic lime or magnesium sulfate, although you have to be careful with too much sulfur fertilizer, it can actually drive your pH down. So you need to mitigate that with your lime applications. But you can apply magnesium, let's say at bud burst, or potassium or nitrogen, and hope that it gets rained into the soil if you get it in before bud burst. And by the time flowering comes and your demand peaks, you should have availability of those nutrients. Same thing for phosphorus. And then you get another little spike of these nutrients just after veraison when fruit is ripening, especially calcium again. And here is where you would probably be relying on foliar sprays to help with ripening of fruit. I'm not saying all foliar sprays are perfect and that they're taken up into vines very efficiently, but I've seen good results with foliar sprays later in the season where we see deficiencies and where we want to make sure we're ripening especially large crops. So this table is basically showing you that if you get things out ahead of the curve, especially in a non-irrigated vineyard, there's a better chance for it to be available and coming into contact with the roots by the time those plants need those nutrients. Okay, so let's look at a sample report. This one's from A&L. This is an older report, Eastern Laboratories. There's Waypoint Analytical. I know you have your local labs you can use there as well. We get the report back from the lab for a petiole test, and it says that we're low in magnesium. We want 0.35, we have 0.16%. It says we're also low in sulfur. So what kind of fertilizer could we use to meet the demands of the vine for both sulfur and magnesium? In this case, I would choose magnesium sulfate because it's got both of those in it. It's inexpensive, it's highly soluble, and it can be worked into the water or to the rain with water or rainfall. I even apply magnesium sulfate through drip irrigation in irrigated vineyards, and that works quite well. Let's say your report says you're a little low in calcium and also in nitrogen. Well, you could apply an inexpensive nitrogen and add some lime to get your calcium, or you could apply something like calcium nitrate. You'd have to look at the budget of the amount of nitrogen and calcium you're actually getting that's available from those products and come up with, in your case, the least expensive combination, but calcium nitrate would get right to the point of addressing your nitrogen and your calcium deficiency in this case. So this is how you can use your plant tissue test to try to formulate or choose already formulated fertilizers for your vineyard applications. This is a report that I was handed by another member of your group from Ohio. It shows me that, yes, we have some low nitrogen. This is a petiole test, and I believe the variety was Chamberson wine grapes. So Chamberson's known for being a little pale green already, yellowish. We're down below 0.8. This is a late season analysis, so I'd like to see it more like 0.7 to 0.8. It's 0.69. So we're probably going to respond with a nitrogen application maybe immediately after harvest of a highly available nitrogen source. Okay, so like ammonium sulfate or something that would be readily available and dissolving into the soil. You don't want to fertilize too much in the fall, but you can put out small amounts such as 5 to 10 pounds or units per acre with no issue of causing excess vigor in most of my experience. And I'd be open to anyone's experience on that as well. When we talk about other deficiencies in this vineyard, potassium's low. It's at 0.33. Near veraison, we want to be closer to 1%, 1.25%. So we could apply potassium starting now and let that potassium work its way into the soil. When I say starting now, I mean right after harvest. We could do a foliar application if we're at veraison and we need to get some potassium into the system before harvest, but you're just not going to get it into the vines by putting it on the ground. It's not going to move quickly. So this would tell me a foliar application of nitrogen and potassium, maybe a product that contains both of those. You could use, I use a lot of Helena products, so maybe a product like Megafol, which contains both nitrogen and potassium. We'd apply that back to back, a few quarts per acre with our fungicide sprays leading into harvest. And then we'd address this issue going into the spring before bud burst with our applications to the soil. So there's a couple ways you can do it. And you do want to respond when you see low numbers like this, you do want to respond quickly And sometimes foliar is going to be your only option for quick application if you don't have irrigation. Okay, so if you want to effectively build a nutrient budget and really understand and have all the pieces of the puzzle year in, year out, and what I do this for is I do this to look for trends. If we're adding fertilizer and we're not seeing results, or if we're seeing deficiencies and they're only happening every few years, why are they happening? You can build a template that would basically have your crop yield and estimated yield. You would have your nutrient data as what you estimate is removed with the crop, and I'll talk about that next. And then you can take your soil samples about every 3 years and look at those. And then if you do use water, include your water sample report. But don't forget, we want plant tissue results at least once a year. I would say at least at veraison, but hopefully you're going to do them at bloom and veraison. So let's talk about that nutrient removal part of this equation, because this is something that I think is not really thought about often enough. Not enough attention is paid to this. But if you look at how nutrients are removed from the vineyard, think about this. Okay, we've got these grapes. Check it out. They're harvesting, right? We're not dropping them due to disease. Let's pretend we're harvesting them, and you just harvested 5 tons per acre of Chambourcin. Let's just call it Chambourcin, since we're on the Chambourcin kick here. 5 tons per acre is not unheard of Chambourcin. You're going to remove between 2 to 6 pounds of nitrogen per ton of Chambourcin. So if the average is 4 pounds, if we're just going to use averages, that means for 5 tons per acre, you've removed 20 pounds of nitrogen in that acre. Now, if your organic matter is 6% and your estimated nitrogen release is 150 to 200 pounds of available nitrogen per year or something like that's high. But if it was there, you may be able to mine that soil for nitrogen and not add anything to it. The way you would find out if that's working or not is by taking your plant tissue test and making sure you're not running into a deficiency over time. Because basically our plants and our roots are mining minerals out of the soil. So when that crop leaves and goes to the winery, it's taking 4 pounds per ton of nitrogen, about 1/2 pound of phosphorus, 5.5 pounds on average, could be as high as 8 pounds of potassium, a little bit of that calcium that you're putting in there, and a lower amount of magnesium. So for example, how is this data useful? If a vineyard I'm working with has high vigor in the vineyard and magnesium deficiency problems, but they have high potassium, we're not going to add potassium for several years probably unless we see a deficiency in plant tissue. And over time, we're hoping that that's going to deplete the soil of more potassium. It's going to go away out of the vineyard with the fruit. It's going to go into a bottle of wine, and it's going to go to a tasting room into someone's home. That's where your vineyard nutrients end up. They end up on the dinner table. Okay, so think about that next time you're having a glass of wine at Thanksgiving. So we're going to remove the leaves in the fall. They may blow out of the vineyard. Some of them may decompose. We're getting some nutrients from those leaves. If you typically take your canes out and take them to the end of the vineyard row and burn them, you're not returning them to the soil. So I have no idea how much nutrient is removed with those canes, but it must be significant. So this is why there's a lot of gray area. You can't just use these numbers in the yellow column and then fertilize back with exactly those amounts each year based on your harvest, because there's other things happening. It's a very dynamic process, but the more you understand the ratios that nutrients are being removed and the ballpark of it, the better you can interpret your data and understand what's going on. Okay, so I know we're not doing a lot of irrigation in Ohio, but I just wanted to point out that if you are irrigating a vineyard, for those listening today that do, you have potentially potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, boron, salts in your water. And the amount of nitrogen in this particular water test, if you watered an acre-foot of water in irrigation per acre per year, you would supply all of the nitrogen needs of that vineyard in 1 year just from your irrigation water. So that's an interesting thing to throw out there. And I think those of you who are not irrigating, you're not going to look at this, but you're definitely going to look at your crop yields year to year, your plant tissue test, and your soil test. Okay, so uptake of fertilizers based on application methods. If you guys have a camera and you want to take a photo of this, you're welcome to. We're going to make the slides available later, but if you want a quick kind of cheat sheet here to have on your phone, I don't mind if you take a photo of my slides. This is just one to help understand application methods and availability to plant. So if you apply most nutrients on the soil surface, as you see, most of the uptake is going to be slow and dependent on rain or incorporation. Nitrogen and potassium are going to move in with rain, so will magnesium, so will boron. Boron is a non-charged elements, so it's going to move pretty quickly. Manganese and zinc a little slower. If you can push nutrients through the drip irrigation, and believe it or not, I've got vineyards I work with in Georgia now that get 30 to 40 inches of rain a year, but we still have irrigation. Number one, because we have Pierce's disease, and there's a product we apply through the irrigation to help mitigate Pierce's disease. But also, we can spend about a third of the cost on fertilizer because irrigation applies it much more efficiently. So you can get nitrogen in very quickly by pushing it in with irrigation, moderately with potassium, fast with magnesium, fast with boron. And then your foliar sprays can be fast for something like nitrogen. I've seen applications of foliar nitrogen and potassium result in a kind of a greening up of the canopy. So we know it's helping to some degree. It's not solving the problem, it's more of a Band-Aid, but when we need something from veraison to harvest to quick fix or help a deficiency in potassium or nitrogen that we see, we can work on it in that direction. Boron's also a good one, and zinc for foliar applications. So products like Orbix from Helena. Again, I'm not affiliated with any company, but Orbix has the nitrogen, potassium, some desert plant extract stuff for stress, and then it has this micronutrient packet in it, which basically has all those micronutrients. So you can find products like that. So if it's a slow uptake or slow available product, applying on the soil, for example, apply well before the peak demand. We showed that slide of the Riesling vines in Germany. You're going to be applying a lot of those nutrients before bud burst so that you can get them into the soil before the demand peaks. If it's a moderate, like if you're dripping it through the drip, or if it's quickly available through the soil, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before peak demand is okay. If you need something quick, that Band-Aid, maybe a foliar application will help you get through until the soil application is available. Okay, speaking of taking photos, that's all I want you to do here. I want you to grab a screen capture, take a photo. This is your cheat sheet. This will tell you how many actual units or pounds per acre of a fertilizer you're applying based on the concentration of that nutrient in the fertilizer. So, if ammonium sulfate contains 21% nitrogen, that means for every 100 pounds of nitrogen you apply per acre, you get 21 pounds or 21 units. That's an exchangeable term by farmers per acre of that nutrient. For liquid fertilizers, if you're applying through foliar or through a drip system, it's a different equation. And then, of course, if you want to know how much nitrogen you're getting in irrigation water, you could use this equation down here. So snip, snap your photo, and we'll make this available for you. As far as compost goes, I've done a lot of work, even back when I worked in Penn State with Jim Travis and Terry Bates and a few other folks who are involved in some projects. This is a picture from California of what I think is my favorite and most efficient way to apply compost in the vineyard. If your whole vineyard floor needs nutrients and you're growing maybe a very shallow rooted grape, something like a hybrid or Concord, maybe application as a broadcast is fine, but this banding of the compost every other row can be very efficient. You can use lower rates of compost, such as if normally the recommendation is 6 tons per acre, you can go as low as 2 or 3. And then the next slide shows a customized tool that's disking the compost in, because you want to really keep those nutrients available in your soil. And a lot of the nitrogen can volatilize, as many of you are aware, if it sits on the soil surface. Rates of compost can vary, and it's tricky, but most growers are going to try to limit the amount of nitrogen they apply based on nitrogen, because there tends to be large amounts of nitrogen available. As I mentioned before, about 20 to 30% of total nitrogen from your compost analysis will be available as a slow release nitrogen, which is a benefit. It's not going to give a shock that bolts your shoots really quick, but it's a slow release, and you don't want to overdo it with the nitrogen. So in Virtual Viticulture Academy, which is the academy where I have my group, so to speak, and my community of growers, I have some tools like this calculator here for compost rates. It's based on available nitrogen. You would fill in the boxes with the desired nitrogen availability per acre. If you wanted 30 units, you put that in here. You put in the results from the lab, the percentage nitrogen, the pounds per yard or pounds per ton of compost weight, and then it will tell you, okay, if you have 5 acres, you need 14 tons of compost, or the rate should be 2.9 tons of that specific compost. So don't just apply compost, get it tested. If the lab's not testing it, or if you're producing your own, send your samples to the lab and get a compost analysis done, at least for nitrogen. Okay, so my advice, I want to make sure I leave time for questions. My advice is that before you plant your vineyard, you would add any needed fertilizers or amendments based on your rooting depth, based on your soil test, and you would try to set the ATM with all of the denominations it needs to get the vines growing healthy. After your vineyard is planted, you want to make a plan to be flexible with the season. So you're going to take your plant test. You're going to respond to the plant test, not a knee-jerk reaction, but you have to make sure you're watching the trends in your plants so that you don't have to apply large amounts of fertilizer after a big deficiency is there. Add only the fertilizers that are needed and at only the rates needed based on plant test and visual observation. Don't just throw out broad spectrum fertilizers because it's what's available and it's what's cheap. You want to make sure you're not throwing off the balance of your sum of cations or base saturation or competing with nutrients by adding too much potassium, which can compete with magnesium, for example. And then fertilize at a time and with a method for best uptake. I tried to cover this briefly, but hopefully it gave you an idea of ground versus foliar versus drip applied fertilizers and how soon you need to apply those relative to that peak in demand. And so if you didn't write this all down, that's okay. We've recorded this talk and we'll make this available. I'm going to also leave you with a few recommended resources. So on my Academy, I do have many free to the public available resources. The target values that I mentioned for nutrients for petioles is on there. That's available. The nutrient values for whole leaves, that's on there. I have some webinars and things that I go into. If you like the style of the presentation today and you want to see more presentations on this topic or different topics, I do have a membership in the Academy where I have some extra stuff available there. I've got lots of free stuff though, like notes on composting your grape pomace or some videos on, I have a new video now on how to properly sample leaf tissue for analysis where I cover both petiole and leaf blade sampling. And that's totally free and available to the public. So I invite you guys to go there and check it out. I also have a lot of workshops I do during the year and I videotape all these because I feel I have lots of members in different states, several in Ohio, Maryland, Virginia, California, Texas. And so I videotape all these. I've probably got over 8 hours of just pruning instruction alone from 2018 to 21. And you can come and hang out with us live now that we're getting through the pandemic. If you ever want to join one of these workshops, I try to do them in different states and get all the members of the Academy together to do this. It's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that, we have all the resources here. I'm, of course, a resource to you here today to answer your questions, whether it's field courses, webinars, or my twice monthly live vineyard advising. That's another thing that I do. I hang out right here in my studio, and twice a month I go live and I answer questions from all of the growers in the field. It's super fun because you hear questions from all over the country and see pictures of their vineyards, and sometimes a picture of their cute vineyard dog. So that's nice too. The Academy site is virtualviticultureacademy.com. And all of my contact is right here. If you want to take another picture of this, you can get in touch with me at Fritz at virtualviticultureacademy.com or just check out the website and grab some free content and let me know what you think. That's the important thing. I want to kind of hear back from you. And if I don't get your question answered today for any reason, such as we run out of time, I want to make sure you can contact me and I welcome you to send your question to me directly.